I want to make some preliminary remarks about Othello that will set you up to read the play in the right mindset. So I'm going to begin by talking about the particular edition we're using this year. It happens to be the Norton Critical Edition, second critical edition. In some senses, it doesn't matter that it's the Norton, but it does matter that it's a critical edition. And this is the main point. And you have to remember that there are many editions out there of Shakespeare that are badly edited, that contain, as you'll see in a minute, misinformation about the play, and that are missing many features that are designed to help scholars engage the text properly. So the first thing I want you to know, or to look at, is the features that are provided in the Norton Critical. And these features are called apparatuses. Basically, an apparatus is any resource that helps us understand the text more deeply or more accurately and helps us engage the text. First, you'll see at the back there's a collection of critical essays. Each time a new version of this Norton Critical comes out, they update some of the essays. Some get deleted, some get added, and some are kept. Those essays are for your convenience, but they also do a number of things. Each one of those essays has at the back of it its own bibliography of other resources that those critics have looked at in order to produce that particular article. So already your research is made much more convenient for you by looking at some of these essays at the back and looking at their bibliographies. Also, here number D is the full bibliography of the Norton itself. So between the critical essays, the bibliographies in the critical essays, and the main bibliography at the back of the Norton, you've got all kinds of extra possible resources that you can access without even necessarily having to go to do your research in other places like Google Scholar. Some of the essays at the back have something, are focused on how the play was acted and received different times in history. We call this reception theory. That is to say, how audiences and directors and actors received the play and transformed it to meet the needs of their particular generation. Something else that I hope you will find very valuable is that at the bottom of each page there is a vocabulary gloss in our Norton that provides an explanation for many of the single words and phrases that might be obscure or difficult for us to decipher. This is not a replacement for you going to the OED and looking up words. You still need to do this all the time, all the time, all the time when you are reading any text written before 1900, simply because the vocabulary is so dangerously slippery. And there are so many other nuanced possible meanings of words that we are unaware of that you need to keep yourself mindful of that. So these are all good reasons for why we want a critical scholarly edition. Here is another one that's very, very important, and it has to do with something called textual variants. So I've got two letters here, Q and an F. Q stands for quarto, Q-U-A-R-T-O, like that, and F stands for folio. That basically is a reference to how the pages were folded when the book was made. That's all it means. So a quarto is where a large sheet of paper would be folded once and then folded a second time, so that each sheet of paper gives you 4 pages on one side and 4 pages on the other side. I'm going to try to provide a link so that you can see how quartos were basically made. But the more important point here is that in 1622 there was an edition of Othello that came out in quarto. And then 1 year later, the folio edition, which both of these are posthumous, by the way. Shakespeare dies in 1616, so he's been dead and buried for some time when these editions come out. But Q1 and F1 are fundamentally different in some very significant ways, and I'm going to show you this. And basically, any text whose editor does not show you the differences between these two editions is doing you a great disservice. And it's very important because most people think that when they go to the bookstore to buy a copy of a Shakespearean play, well, Hamlet is Hamlet and Lear is Lear. Absolutely not. There were 5 different editions of Hamlet put out either in Shakespeare's lifetime or in 1623, which is the first folio, which is the first time that all of his plays were collected into one single volume. And those differences, variations in Hamlet, some of them are minor, like punctuation and so on, but some of them are major, where Q1 in Hamlet, so-called the bad quarto, is 2,000 lines shorter than the folio version, and then Q2, the second quarto. But it plays better on stage, and it's got more stage directions. There are differences in the 5 editions of Hamlet where characters have different names, and where lines are spoken in one edition by one character, but in another edition by a different character. And so all of this is very bewildering when the differences are significant, because it makes our ability to do a close textual reading much more complex and much more sophisticated. King Lear is another example. There are 2 significant differences of Lear, the quarto and the folio. Again, one of the things that you may come across over time is the Norton has decided in their edition of Lear to provide us with 3 different editions of the same play. So first off, you get what's called a split edition. So on the left-hand page, you get the Q1 version, and on the right-hand page, you get the F1 version, so you can see line for line and word for word what's different. Then they put a composite edition together as well that sort of combines both. In our text of Othello, our Norton editors have followed that editorial policy and have given us, not quite the split edition that I was talking about, but have given us some very important textual variants. So these variants show up in the text in several different ways. I'm just going to go to page 37 of the Norton second. But even if you're using a different critical edition, this is a modern edition from the University of Victoria website. It's pretty easy to find. You simply go to Google, type in University of Victoria Shakespeare. When you get there, take plays and poems. When you mouse over this text, you'll see that it will take you to Othello, and it has 3 different versions of Othello. F1, right here, the first folio, 1623. It's got Q1, the first quarto, 1622, and it has a modern edition that is a composite of both and that pretty well matches our Norton edition. So when you get to the play, the first thing it's going to do is give you simply Act 1, Scene 1. But I like to see the whole play. So you just click on Complete Text, and then the whole play will appear for you. And I'm just going to do a word search here because I want to get to Act 2, Scene 1, She That Was Ever Fair. So I'm just going to show you. Here it is here. She that was ever fair and never proud, had tongue at will and yet was never loud. So this is Iago here, bad-mouthing women. And I want you to notice that in our text, this particular speech is in italics. And that's because it does not appear in F1. It actually appears in the quarto, but not in the folio version. So in our Norton edition, the editors have taken F1 as the main, they call it the copy text, or the main base text of the play. And so essentially what we have here is F1. The problem is that F1 is missing quite a few lines that are present in the quarto, but not present in the folio. So what our editors have done is silently made, not silently, but explicitly, in making this composite edition, have used italics to show us where text occurs that was in the quarto only. Let me put it to you one more way so that you're clear on this. The italics tell you that the text you're reading comes from Q and is not present in F1. So if you were technically reading F1, those italicized lines would not be there. But our editors are being transparent and showing us what the quarto lines would also have been. So that's very important. The second way that the text manages things is through something called variora. So if you go to page 133 at the back of the Norton, one of the things it shows us is that even that opening word of the play, which is very dramatic, it's Iago going tss. So the play begins with some sort of preliminary discussion that has been going on, and we're introduced to these characters in the middle of a discussion, and you've got Iago telling Rodrigo basically to shut up. Well, that first word tss, does not appear in the folio, but it does appear in the quarto. Or is it the other way around? Just a minute, let me make sure here. Sorry, it appears in the folio, but not the quarto, because it's not italicized. But at 133, following, there are about 2.5 pages of textual variants. Some of them are significant, some of them are not. For example, Act 1, Scene 1, line 22. One version, our version, has tongued, but the quarto version has toged, which is a very different word, obviously. So, and at 158, our edition has kisses, but the other edition has sighs. Well, they're not the same words, and so our text, because it is scholarly and because these guys know what they're doing when they edit these texts, they're giving us a full and sophisticated version of the complexity of the text that we're dealing with. Now, I come to something called the source text. And source texts are, especially in Shakespeare's day, plays from which Shakespeare derived his plot. And you need to understand that in Shakespeare's day, plagiarism didn't mean what it means today, and that authors often borrowed and reworked various plots. So there is a source text to Othello by a writer named Giovanni Battista Giraldi, who goes by the pseudonym of Cinthio. And he was alive between 1504 and 1573. And I'll just show you a web page here I've got for Cinthio. There it is, right back there. So Cinthio writes a text called Hecatomachy. Hecatomachy. It's a hard one to get. Hecatomachy is a collection of tales strung together one after the other. One of the tales is the source for Othello, and the other one is the source for Measure. Now, why am I raising this? I'm raising this because the original story that Shakespeare probably borrowed from is very different from Shakespeare's play. And we have, I think, if we study these differences, we have a little bit of a clue about what Shakespeare's intentions were when he wrote the play. Now, I want to be very careful here because there was a critic named Roland Barthes who was around in the late 60s and developed a literary theory that basically said the author's intentions do not matter in our interpretation of any literary text. It doesn't matter what the author said. What matters is what the author intended. It's how we interpret the text that matters. And one implication that even goes beyond this is that the author himself or herself is completely irrelevant to the meaning of the text. And that's because we rarely know an author's intention when they were writing a story. Sometimes it's possible to glean an author's intention if they wrote a letter to another friend of theirs saying, in this particular play or poem, I really intended to do this. Sometimes, as in the case of Dracula, we have Bram Stoker's manuscript, and we can see systematically the changes that he made in pen as he began to modify the story. And when you follow those clues, you get some hint about authorial intention. But you should, if you ever catch yourself saying Shakespeare intended this to happen, stop. Do not put it that way because you don't know what Shakespeare intended. What we do know is what the text invites us to conclude from our reading of it. That said, I want to talk about Cinthio's source. And this particular collection of tales was not available in English at the time that Shakespeare wrote it. He writes the story in 1565. Shakespeare's born 1564. So he writes it basically when Shakespeare is a baby. It stays in the Italian. It never got translated into English, but we do know it got translated into French. I'll give you the guy's name here. Chapuis, Chappuy, in 1584 in Paris. So it is possible that the plot line of the play at least made its way to Shakespeare. And you can see when I show you the changes that Shakespeare made here, you can sort of see what he's up to. So just take a look at this. Cinthio tells the tale of Desdemona, that's spelt with a D-I, and a Moorish captain duped by his villainous ensign or standard bearer, so that's Iago. In Cinthio's story, the virtuous and beautiful Desdemona is the only character to be given a name. That's really interesting. Every other character is nameless. Against the advice of her relatives, she marries the gallant Moor, not through lust, but for love of his valor. So she resists her family pressure. We're told here that in Cinthio, the Moor is made a commander of the Venetian forces, and so he goes off to Cyprus with Desdemona and his deceptive ensign, which we know is Iago, and with his wife in Shakespeare, that's Amelia, and a corporal in Shakespeare, that's Cassio. Now look at the original story. It's the ensign who falls in love with Desdemona. So in the source text, Iago falls in love with Desdemona, not Othello. Is rejected by her, and therefore plots to convince the Moor that she has been unfaithful with the corporal, that is to say Cassio. Now this is interesting because this is a real plot, and Shakespeare takes that out, and the result of that is that we have a huge problem with Iago's motivation. He gives us multiple different motivations for why he hates Othello. One time he says because he didn't get the promotion. Another time he says, well, because rumor has it that that Othello has done my office twixt the sheets. In other words, has been having sexual intercourse with Desdemona or with Amelia behind my back, and that's why I hate him. And in other places he says he just hates him because. But this is absolutely critical because in Cinthio, Iago has a motivation for hating the Moor. in Shakespeare, he doesn't. And this makes Iago that much more cryptic character, because we really can't penetrate through all of the layers that he has going for him. Also in Cinthio, the Moor demands ocular proof, which is very interesting because this is very much, as I'll show you, a play about seeing. Take a look also at how Cinthio ends the story. The ensign in Cinthio, that is to say the Iago character, is bribed by the Moor to kill the corporal. So Othello pays Iago to murder Cassio, but only wounds him as he comes away from a courtesan's, that is to say a prostitute's house. Together they also scheme to murder Desdemona by beating her with a stocking filled with sand, and then disguising it as an accident caused by the ceiling falling down. So Desdemona's murder is actually at the hands of both Othello and Iago, and Shakespeare has taken that away, so that the focus of the tragedy is strictly on Othello, not on Othello acting violently in cahoots with Iago. After her death, this is still Cinthio, the Moor and the ensign turn against each other. The Moor is tortured, exiled, and killed by Desdemona's relatives. Wow. Huge difference, because in Shakespeare, Othello kills himself. The ensign, that is to say the Iago character, continuing his villainy, is finally imprisoned for another crime and dies as a result of torture. So, significantly, in Cinthio's version, Desdemona comes to heartache when she, of her own accord, comes to realize that she has married a man so different from her in color, culture, and creed that she can never see eye to eye. So in Cinthio, Desdemona has second thoughts about marrying Othello, and she begins to waver in her love for him. There is an editorial note in our Norton, if I can find it very quickly, I will, where our editor talks about changing one little word in a variant between the quarto and the folio edition. If I can find it quickly, I will. Might be at the beginning. There's a line where Desdemona says that I love the Moor, but in one of the textual variants, she says that I did love the Moor. So that one extra word, did, changes love from the present tense, I love the Moor, to I did love the Moor, to past tense, which is a kind of bow to Cinthio's version where she falls out of love with her husband. The Desdemona in Shakespeare never does that. She's loyal and faithful and true to the end. So Shakespeare's changed that also. Also in Cinthio, it is the ensign who murders Desdemona at the Moor's urgings, of course, and then the Moor repents and goes after the ensign, who confesses to everybody that the Moor put him up to it. So these differences are some clue about what Shakespeare was trying to do. And it's clear that he's trying to make Iago more complex. It's clear that he's trying to assign more responsibility to Othello for his actions. And it's clear that Shakespeare seems to want to make Desdemona a more loyal and faithful wife, which makes the tragedy of this play a little more deep and painful. So the source text is helpful at giving us some clues about Shakespeare's intention, but without really knowing what Shakespeare wrote, we have to be very, very careful in how we use that. To set this play up, I want to return to the topic of humanism. which really is about the discovery of everything human in a secular sense. And in particular, Shakespeare is very interested in human psychology. And I've talked about this before. Certainly, if you look at the title of so many of his plays, especially the tragedies, they're all about one single character who becomes the focus. Macbeth, Hamlet, Lear, Othello, Titus Andronicus, Coriolanus, Antony and Cleopatra, Pericles, the list goes on and on. Richard II, Richard III, Henry IV, Henry V, Henry VIII, what's her name? It'll come to me just a minute. Cymbeline. So many of Shakespeare's plays have a main psychological entity at the core of it. And this play really is an exploration of the relationship between love and jealousy. So it invites us to think about how these two things are related, and whether jealousy is a necessary outcropping or consequence of love. And there is a discussion that you want to watch for. I think it's in Act 5 or might be end of Act 4, between Emilia and Desdemona. And Emilia says that she fears that her husband, like other husbands, have, quote unquote, poured their treasures into foreign laps, meaning that their husbands have been ejaculating their semen into other women, and that adultery seems to be the nature of human beings. And even Emilia herself, in that same discussion with Desdemona, they're talking. Emilia says, "Would you be unfaithful to your husband if it meant that you would bring him great power and great reward?" And Desdemona says, "No, what's right is right and what's wrong is wrong." And Emilia says, "Well, it's only one time. It's not a big thing. Maybe I would do it for my husband." And so at the core of these two central relationships that are mirrored in this play, Iago and Emilia's relationship and Othello and Desdemona's relationship, at the core of that is the relationship between love and jealousy. And what Iago does in part is to take the poisoned jealousy in his mind about his own relationship and persuade Othello that this is something he ought to be concerned about in his. We're also looking at the nature of evil and the motivation for evil. And I've already told you that compared to the Cinthio version, what Shakespeare does is take away the solidity of Iago's motivation. And so we really don't know why he does what he does. He's got all these different reasons, and he's very much like the Heath Ledger's Joker in the Batman movie, where he's got that really his mouth has been cut sort of across his whole face, and at one point he says that his father did it to him. At another point he says that he did it to himself to make his wife happy because her face was disfigured. And there's so much bullshit and discrepancies about how he got his mouth to be so wide that at the end of the day we end up believing none of it. It's just a facade. And so Iago has that. And the last words that Iago utters in this play is, "Demand me nothing, which you know. From this time forth I will never speak a word." And they haul him off to be tortured, and he's not going to say anything about why he does it. And so what Shakespeare seems to be probing here is the notion that evil in our lives can be completely unmotivated. That should be even more frightening than an evil that is personal and vindictive. This is just victimization for the sake of victimization. There's also the possibility that, of course, Iago's villainy is driven by racism, which, as I'll talk about in a minute, is a very complex issue in this play. Now, I posted something in Moodle, you'll see it, called Script Act Theory, and this is something you have to be very aware of when you read any dramatic text. The notion of Script Act Theory is as follows: that the words on the page don't mean anything because we have such little direction in how to interpret them. So even musical notation, if you think about it, when music is written down, we have some clue about how fast it is, about how loud it is, about how much legato there is, where the notes are sort of blending and flowing into the other very smoothly, or how much staccato there is, where the notes are very choppy. Musical notation gives us all kinds of interpretive information, but the English language doesn't. It's just the words on the page. And the example I like to use is from The Merchant of Venice, where Shylock, who is badly abused by Venetians, and who also badly abuses them, it's a kind of mutual hatred, is brought into court under a trick by a female lawyer named Portia. And she's dressed as a man, so she's not exactly authentic either. But in that trial scene, what happens is Shylock is totally humiliated. He is forced to his knees, which for a Jew is an affront to their fundamental belief that they should not worship anything except the true God. And the court says to Shylock, we've taken away all your money, you've lost your daughter, you've lost your property, and we're going to force you to convert to Christianity. What say you? And the three words on the page are, I am content. So the question is, how do we interpret those words? And in many productions, Shylock is just on his knees and he's sort of just resigned to the fact that it's over. However, there is a version with Al Pacino where they force him to his knees and he begins to cry. And they take this huge crucifix and they slam it into his face. And he is on his knees and convulsing in tears and quivering, and he barely spits out the words, I am content, in a way that clearly indicates that he is not content. So script act theory says, I know what the words say on the page, but the actors can change that meaning by tone of voice, by cadence, by body language. There's so many different ways to interpret the play. Let me put it to you one more way. Script act theory says there is no text. I'll say it again, there is no text. The meaning of the play only comes into being when actors deliver the words on stage and in context, embodied in a voice that is either loud or soft, where the cadence is going up or the cadence is going down, where other characters are either around them or not around them. And so each play, the text of each play basically has an infinite potential variety of interpretations. And so you want to be careful that you are mindful as you're doing an analysis of this play that we can't be 100% sure that the words mean what they mean. We think they mean. So that's a double jeopardy here, because I've already told you that in the first place there's these significant differences between the first quarto and the first folio, and I'm telling you now, there's, because of script act theory, there's also these differences between what the text literally says and the infinite possibilities that we could bring to it as producers and actors. Lastly, I want to say that Othello is a play about visualization. Imagining things mentally. And we know that the human mind is driven by visualization, and that when we imagine things to be real, they actually become real. In a positive sense, this means that we can change our lives positively by imagining things, but in a negative sense, it means we can also undermine ourselves by thinking negative things. And so the whole point about all of this is that visualization is what Iago does. What Iago does is put into Othello's head all these notions about what his wife is doing with Cassio. And at one point, Iago says to Othello, well, I happen to be sleeping with Cassio, and he threw his leg over me and embraced me and said sweet things, calling me Desdemona. That's a visual that Iago plants in Othello's head. And once you see something, you can't unsee it. This is the point about visualization. So, and also Iago says to Othello at a different point, he says, well, what if she was to have sex with everybody in your squadron on the battlefield? And once that thought is in Othello's head, he can't get rid of it. So keep that in mind as you are working through the play. So the play is asking us, what is human nature? What is evil? What is love? There are certain motifs and recurrences in this play that happen all the time. And one of the advantages of having a digital edition like this one is when you watch the whole play, you can type in a word like see and say, I just want the whole words. And let me put this right up to the top here. So the word see appears 38 times in this play, which is significant. You'll see also epithets like honest Iago everywhere. But this is a play about not being able to see. And I don't want you to think that Othello is blind. That is not what I'm saying. I'm saying that Othello can see perfectly well. In fact, in many ways, his life in Venice is literally, as well as symbolically, black and white. So the problem is that you cannot see that the epistemological nature of Shakespeare's world is so confusing that everybody has trouble seeing. The opening scene, if you look at it, is Brabantio in the streets, or is Rodrigo and Iago in the streets below Brabantio's balcony. And Brabantio can't see who's talking. He can only hear. And a disembodied voice comes up from the street and says, a black ram is tupping your white ewe. And that racist epithet is something that Brabantio hears. It's also a visual. But he can't see who said it, so he doesn't know where it's coming from. And if you watch different cinematic versions of Othello, pay attention to Iago, because in a lot of cases he speaks to Othello from behind so that Othello can't see him talking, and he'll go beside one ear and Othello will turn this way, and then Iago appears over here and Othello has to turn that way. This motif or recurring pattern of not being able to see is also manifest in Cyprus when the people on the shoreline say that they can't tell where the sea ends and the sky begins. That's another epistemological problem. Epistemology means how we know what we know. When you can't see things clearly, it doesn't make you stupid and it doesn't make you naive. It means that the world that you're living in is very sinister because it is so disguised. I want to say one final thing about this play. And that has to do with the notion of race and racism. And I left it to the end because it really is one of the most important things, but I want you to be aware of it. You'd have to be some kind of fool to say that race is not important in this play. It's just everywhere. And the racism directed to Othello behind his back and to his face is manifestly clear. He is an outsider. He is a foreigner. He is other. He is not to be trusted. Brabantio says that that it's unnatural for a white woman to want to have sexual relations with a black man. And watch for it carefully. You'll see throughout the play that there are concerns that everybody has about the children of interracial couples. And Iago says, that the devil is going to make a grandsire of you, and that your children are all going to look like Othello with this sooty, this black skin complexion. And so the anxiety is not just around the presence of Othello in Venetian society. That's one thing. The anxiety is also around his ability to attract white women, like Desdemona, and even beyond that, Brabantio thinks it's unnatural for black and white people to want to have sexual intercourse together. Beyond that is, what about the children? Because the children come out neither one nor the other. Now, this anxiety, I think, contaminates the entire workings of the play. So I want to begin by saying, in the first instance, excuse me, this is definitely a play about race. Secondly, however, this is not a play about race. And I think that if you make it only about race, you are going to demean the sophistication and the nuanced complexity of the character of Othello. He is a remarkably intelligent man. He is, in spite of the fact that he says he's a soldier and a man of simple words, he is not. His speech to the Venetian court about how we use witchcraft to seduce Desdemona is a brilliant piece of oratory. Brilliant. And so he is clearly more masterful than he lets people on. And so I think it's a mistake to read him as a naive puppet who is manipulated by Iago. I think that's a very dangerous and untrue reading of this text. I think that the more you make Othello sophisticated and intelligent, the more interesting that relationship becomes. Excuse me. Finally, before my voice gives out completely, I want you to think about the possibility that Iago and Othello are doppelgangers of each other. That is to say that they are the same character. Take a look, especially in how they see their wives and in how they think, because what Iago does very well is to move Othello over basically to his way of thinking. All right, I hope that gets you started on the play. There's lots to think about. Good luck. It's a fantastic play.